are in that situation where you're going to meet a new person, what is our tendency, especially if we're in a work context? It's to ask questions like, so what do you do? Right? Which is a bright signal that you only care about them inside of a work context because you're asking them a work question. So look for something else. So I'll ask questions like, where did you grow up? Or actually, my favorite question is, who's your favorite superhero?
Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with thought leaders such as Kevin Kelly, Brad Feld, Steve Blank, Gretchen Rubin, Tim Harford, Adam Grant, Tim O'Reilly, Tyler Cowan, and many, many more on topics that will help you gain a distinct advantage, not only in the world of creativity and innovation, but in your entire professional and personal life. Each and every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some short, high-impact and easily digestible insights to have you finishing your week on a high. Future Squared is powered by Collective Campus, a corporate innovation school, consultancy, and startup accelerator that works with large organizations to help them unlock their people's often latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning those ideas into reality, creating a culture of innovation, or partnering with startups, visit collectivecampus.io. So without further ado, let's get into today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. In this episode, I welcome back David Burkus, named one of the world's top business thought leaders by Thinkers 50 last year. His forthcoming book, Friend of a Friend, offers readers a new perspective on how to grow their networks and build key connections, one based on the science of human behavior, not rote networking advice. He's also the author of Under New Management and the Myths of Creativity. David is a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review, and his work has been featured in Fast Company, The Financial Times, Inc. Magazine, Bloomberg BusinessWeek, and CBS This Morning. David's innovative views on leadership have earned him invitations to speak to leaders from a variety of organizations. He's delivered keynote speeches and workshops for Fortune 500 companies such as Microsoft, Google, and Stryker, and governmental and military leaders at the US Naval Academy and Naval Postgraduate School. His TED Talk has been viewed over 1.7 million times. When he's not speaking or writing, David is in the classroom. He's an associate professor of leadership and innovation at Oral Roberts University, where he was recently named one of the nation's top 40 under 40 professors who inspire. I enjoyed reconnecting with David and learned a lot, some of which I applied the day after the interview with positive results. You'll learn 1. Why the best way to grow your network might not be by introducing yourself to strangers at cocktail parties, but by finding strength in weak ties. 2. Why the biggest opportunities lie not inside tight-knit communities or clusters, but in between them. And 3. How to 10x the effectiveness of your warm introduction requests. With that, welcome back to the show almost 220 episodes later, the one and only David Burkus. Welcome back to the show, Dave.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back on. It only took 2 years for the stench of that first episode to wear off, and I'm so gracious that you're having me back on.
I think the stench was coming from me. That was literally episode number 9, so let's just say I had little experience.
Then I'm like a charter member of this thing. Now I'm excited. Yeah, exactly.
Early, first class alumni. I mean, if it wasn't for David Burkus coming on the show in literally...
Well, and the 8 other people, but yeah.
And the 8 other people, no one else would have come after that. When I went to market after you were on the show, it was we've had David Burkus on the show, author of Under New Management, and the floodgates just opened.
We should have a reunion. Yeah, we should have a reunion, yeah.
So what's been keeping you busy in the last 2 years, Dave?
So, the last 2 years, Under New Management only came out about 2 years ago. So we were hitting that hard and really, we were very, very fortunate in how that message has resonated. So one of the more controversial chapters in that book is the salary transparency chapter, as I'm sure you know, and I was privileged to I gave a TEDx talk specifically on that. TED actually liked it so much they put it on TED.com, which was really cool, which meant we're approaching 2 million views, and I've lost count of how much hate mail. So that's been really, really cool. But really for the last year, I've been hiding again in a hole because I had an idea for a book that came to me during What didn't come to me, I generated it, but that's a whole other thing about semantics. During the writing of Under New Management, it was an idea that I really kind of wanted to pursue once the big hubbub of Under New Management was over. So for the last year or so, I've been doing that, and that book is now out or about to be out, called Friend of a Friend, and I'm really excited about the message.
Yeah, and Friend of a Friend is all about understanding the hidden networks that can transform your life and your career. And you just mentioned something about semantics. I mean, how did you come to research this book, Dave, or to put this book together?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of me being a nerd and then a little bit of me seeing a need. And the nerd me is, in both of the books I've written before, Missive Creativity and Under New Management, we touch on a couple different studies from the world of network science. I mean, I find network science as a discipline fascinating. The studies of Duncan Watts and Brian Uzi and Jarrett Spiro, or going way back into the 70s, Mark Granovetter and those folks. And so I really wanted to do something in that. You know, when you write two different books and you go, well, I've touched on these studies every single time, I should probably go deeper in these studies because I clearly enjoy it. But the big question was sort of need. And when I started to dig deeper into them, which I didn't have time to do during Under New Management, but then started to do, trying to feel out where is the next idea, I started to realize that there are, in the world of sort of networking books, most of them are advice books, right? And they're good, you know, How to Win Friends and Influence People, or Never Eat Alone, or et cetera. But they're all collections of advice, usually one person's advice, usually one guy's advice. And they are advice based on that person's experience, and that person, you know, here's how I did it, so you should do it too. Or the slightly more enticing, I didn't do this and now I did and it changed my life, right? But both of those things are just advice. Yeah. And advice works great if you're the same person in the same situation or a similar situation, but a lot of people aren't. And I think that's the reason why when we try and apply that advice, so many people, networking makes them feel dirty. They feel awkward. They feel like that sleazy weirdo pushing business cards, you know, in the back of the room at a networking mixer. Yeah. And so the thesis now was, okay, well, maybe you don't need advice. Maybe what we need is to understand how networks work. And if we can get a feel from network science about what are the universal principles that every network, every industry, every organization, et cetera, organizes by. And if we can do that, then we can come up with a plan to grow and better your network that works for everyone, because it's based in science and then tailored to you.
Yeah. And I see this with a lot of business books. You mentioned Never Eat Alone and How to Win Friends and Influence People. Whatever the book is, there is a tendency to rely a little bit too much on anecdotes that apply to an individual person. And even last week, I mentioned before the show that I had a conversation with Alex Hutchinson, and we were talking about all the conventional wisdom that's out there about how you should eat and how you should exercise and all this sort of stuff. And so much of it comes from one person who basically just spews forth what works for them, even though someone else may have a totally different body, totally different DNA makeup, all the rest of it, live in a different part of the world, different climate, different job, and so on. So you can't just take one thing and expect it to apply for everyone. And I like the fact that this book, Friend of a Friend, is based on the science of networks. And one thing that I really like about this book is that it promises that there is a better way to network, away from, you know, the conventional handing out business cards at cocktail parties and conferences and that sort of thing. So as someone who absolutely, quote unquote, loves conferences, Dave, let's explore this topic. I mean, starting with finding strength in weak ties.
Yeah. So, I mean, all right. So the good news is, for people that quote unquote, right, or even people that no quotes and no irony, love it. Like the good news is, whether you actually love doing that or whether you hate it, like most people, you don't ever have to do that again. You actually, I mean, if you stay true to the principles of network science, you probably never have to run around meeting strangers. There's a better way to do it, right? And we can talk about some of the better ways to do it, but one of the reasons that you don't have to really run around and try and meet all sorts of strangers cold at these mixers or what have you, is that your most potent opportunities, I like to call it the low-hanging fruit in networking, comes from the sociological term is weak ties, or even better, dormant ties. And these are actually two different things. A weak tie is that acquaintance. It's that person that you know because you see them at work or you see them at the gym. You know their name and maybe you might know their job, et cetera, but you don't really know them well and know much about them. And then a dormant tie is someone that you did know really well at some point, but then for some reason or another, they went off in their own direction and did something else. Now, both dormant ties and weak ties are potent sources of new information, new opportunities, new introductions to the people you do need to meet. simply because they're not you. They're not close to you. And what we find is that people tend to cluster together, and your close friends, they think like you, they act like you, they know all the people that you know. Actually, the sociological term is redundant. They're literally a redundancy. If they all think like you and act like you, et cetera, then there's no point. They're redundant. They're just you. So these weak ties or dormant ties become this very potent source of information. That's a great place to start because you already know them. It's not that awkward, weird pushing business cards or trying to perfect an elevator pitch, et cetera. It's just either an invitation to take a loose affiliation a little bit deeper or an invitation to reconnect with someone for whom you did have a deep relationship with. And both of those situations provide the same, if not better, information and better motivation to help you than does trying to run around and meet strangers and hope that one of them turns out to be beneficial for your career, your life, et cetera.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess one question I have on weaker ties, be they dormant or weak ties, is, why should they help us? If we haven't spoken to them in such a long time, they're fallen off the radar, and we suddenly, rear our heads, say, hey, I see you're connected with this person. Can you make an introduction or something to that effect? What does the research uncover in that space?
Yeah, well, they shouldn't. They don't have any obligation to, right? You don't owe them anything. And the truth is, I think it comes most powerfully when you don't take that approach, when you don't just reach out and go, okay, hey, we haven't talked in a while, but I know you're friends with this person. Can you introduce me? Really, what I encourage people to do is to make it a regular habit, like 1 weak tie or one dormant tie per week, et cetera, that you're just constantly sort of re-engaging or rechecking in so that when the time does come, there's a little bit deeper relationship there. Right. The other thing is that you never actually know. I don't know how many times in my life that when I was actively trying to help someone else, it turned out to benefit me just as much, if not more, right? So I encourage when you're doing that reconnecting, look for ways to provide value for them. Look for ways to be their valuable weak tie. And then I don't know if you want to call it karma or sowing what you reap or whatever you want to call it. It generally tends to come back to you, at least in my own life, it always has. Now, I realize that's anecdotal. But again, the big shift, the network science-based shift, is that we so often think about networks and contact as like the list of contacts on our phone. And in reality, what the metaphor we should be using for networking is that we exist inside of a network. And reaching out to the weak ties and dormant ties is an example of understanding the three-dimensional plane of our network, not a list of contacts on our phone. Yes. And when you provide value into that network by reaching out and reconnecting with these people, that value is what sociologists call social capital. And eventually you provide enough value into the network, and that value will start to come out whether you're trying to force it or not.
Yeah, it's effectively every time you provide value into that network, you could see that as a form of deposit, if you will. And the more value you provide, the more social capital you build, and the more you can actually do with that social capital over time.
Exactly. Exactly how it works. Adam Grant has kind of messed with my mind in this whole idea of givers, takers, and matchers. Mm-hmm. And so I try not to go, okay, well, that analogy is exactly right, but don't keep track of your deposits because then you're just sort of a matcher, right? Just give into the network, create value for it, and trust that by doing that, you're building social capital and it's there when you need it.
Yeah. And I particularly like what you said there about when you're reconnecting with people. Don't just reconnect out of the blue and say, hey, can you introduce me to this person? It requires a little bit of rapport building. And you see this not only with networking in the traditional sense, where you're just wanting to connect with an individual person, but also online in the world of influencer marketing. You get so many people who will just reach out to an influencer and say, hey, I wrote this article, would love if you would share it. And it's like, well, who are you and why should I share your article? And the wisdom in that space is you want to connect with people, you want to share their articles, you want to mention them in a blog post you wrote, you want to build that rapport over time so that when the time is right, they actually know who you are, they see that you've been supporting their work for a little while, they have some sort of affinity for you, and they're more likely to support you by that point. Whereas if you just reach out cold, then you're not going to get the support, be it in your immediate network or be it on some sort of social network online.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I'll take it a step further. And the other thing that research kind of points to is that the truth is you don't actually know who you want to be connected to, right? So follow me on this. So yeah, you're sending an email off to a weak tie or trying to reconnect with a weak tie, and you mentioned, can you introduce me to so-and-so? Mm-hmm. Remember, that person is operating in a different part of the network, sometimes a different geography, a different industry, whatever. They have a much better sense of the people around them in that area of the network than you do, and they have a better sense of who the right connection for you would be. right? So I actually encourage people, don't really ever ask the question unless it's like a really close friend and and you have a deliberate kind of plan. Most of the time, you're going to get way more traction if, as you're reconnecting, maybe on the second or third conversation with a weak tie that you're reconnecting with, or a dormant tie that you're reconnecting with, or a weak tie that you're strengthening, ask a question like, hey, who do you know in blank, with blank being the sort of industry or sector or company that you're looking to get into? Because what that allows the other person to do is run through their list of people that they know. Now, that person that you would have originally asked for an introduction, they may be on that list or they may not. But nonetheless, they're going to run through a mental list of people they think is the best people for you to connect with. And then they're also probably only going to mention names that they are already comfortable introducing you to. So you're giving them the chance to sort of opt in to making that introduction instead of putting them in that really weird spot of asking for it. And then they've got to think, well, do I really want to vouch for this person or not, et cetera. Right. So don't really, honestly, most of the time, don't even ask, can you introduce me to so-and-so, but ask a really open-ended question like, who do you know in blank, with blank being whatever sector you're trying to meet more people in.
Yeah. And effectively what you're doing there is moving away from what is essentially a leading question, a yes or no, will you introduce me, to what is an open-ended question, do you know anyone in this space? And that is effectively limitless in terms of the number of people they might know in that capacity. So yeah, I can see that as a very empowering question. I guess in some cases it may be limiting where you are reaching out to someone who perhaps has a lot of, say, stuff on their plate and they're super busy and they just want you to dictate, hey, who do you want me to introduce you to? But in most cases, I dare say that asking that open-ended approach or asking that open-ended question will deliver better results.
Right, exactly. And remember, this is like something to bring up during a larger conversation. This isn't sort of the direct ask. And if I can, so there's the psychology of the question part, but if I can get a little network nerdy on me for a second,
let's do it.
There's a real sort of provable network science reason too. I mean, so the next chapter in the book after this one that we're talking about is about the 6 degrees of separation phenomenon that we all sort of have at least heard about anecdotally, or maybe you've played 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. But there really have been a series of different studies where you basically you recruit a bunch of volunteers and then you tell them, hey, this specific person, in the very first study, it was a stockbroker in Boston, right? Can you get this letter to that person, and how many links does it take? And it really does take between 5 and 6 introductions for any person in the world to be connected to anybody else. But here's where it gets really cool. In a world of Facebook and LinkedIn, et cetera, Facebook's actually started to do some studies that if you have a Facebook account, it's not 6 introductions, it's 4. Right? Now, part of that is because you're in a sort of a more connected world. But the other part is the way that Facebook does it. They're not recreating the experiment of, can you deliver this message to this person? They're looking at the entire network, 2 billion users and counting, and then using algorithms to map the optimal route. And the optimal route is usually not the route that people would go if they were trying to make the introductions. Now, what does that all mean? Basically, what that means is that you don't know, when you're trying to get an in to a certain industry or person, et cetera, what the right route to that person is. So if you keep your options open by asking that who do you know in blank style question, you may discover a more efficient path to who you're trying to connect to than just trying to map it yourself the way people did in the old school studies.
Yeah. I draw parallels between what you said there and the world of innovation, where people may jump to conclusions with the first idea they have, rather than, say, building some sort of a low fidelity prototype, putting that to market, getting a lot of feedback from people, and then iterating over time, rather than spending all their money and effort putting a perfect quote unquote product to market, running out of resources and it not serving any real purpose. So, jumping to conclusions, one of those cognitive biases I guess it applies just as much in networking as it does in the realm of creativity and innovation. And I guess on Facebook, on LinkedIn, tools are only as good as how you use them. And it's often been said that great entrepreneurs aren't necessarily geniuses. They just learn how to see the opportunities around them. And so when it comes to networking, I guess it's not so much a matter of people with the best collection of connections, but people who, as you say in your book, can see and navigate their networks, who are in a more likely position to succeed.
It is exactly right. If you're using a mental model of my network as a list of contacts on my phone, then you're playing with a conceptualization of how the world works that puts you at a disadvantage compared to the people that go, I exist inside of a larger network, and my goal in networking is to see as much of that network as I can and know where I'm supposed to head from there. And that's a very different sort of 2D contacts app on my phone versus 3-dimensional, I can picture who's connected to who and all of that. Those people are going to win almost every time.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned Kevin Bacon, Dave. 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, which was what you tell the story in your book of the, three potentially inebriated fraternity brothers.
Well, I mean, they're fraternity brothers, so we can probably guess that they're potentially inebriated. But yeah, I mean, this is an amazing story because it's a fluke of history, right? That they're watching television, they're just sort of spacing out like undergrads do from time to time, and they suddenly realize like, wow, we've just watched 3 movies and all of them have Kevin Bacon in, and they start to like study this thing. And so the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon was born, and they're creating, algorithms based on IMDb databases, et cetera, that can connect any 2 actors to him or herself, to each other without going through Kevin Bacon. But the interesting thing is you don't actually need Kevin Bacon. He's not actually that much of a linchpin. In fact, I think he's like the 600th and something most connected person in Hollywood. It's just that any sort of complex network like that has shortcuts. In the case of Hollywood, it's people that go from one genre to another that now make it easier to transcend from one genre of a movie to another, or one time period to another. In the case of sort of the real world, it's people that change jobs. It's people that move to a different geography. It's people that make giant career changes, and suddenly they're working in the nonprofit or public sector when they were 20 years in the corporate sector. And what that allows you to do is take these shortcuts that keeps the world much more tightly connected than we ever think. And that's why we have that situation. I'm sure you've been in it, where you meet somebody and then you find out that you both know this person, and you go, oh, it's such a small world. Well, yeah. It kind of is, and it's not because of people like Kevin Bacon. It's because of those people that transition and move around.
Yeah. And for our audience who want to learn more about the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, or a app that evolved from it, check out the Oracle of Bacon, where you can basically enter the name of 2 movie stars, and in seconds the program will find the shortest distance between them. So a small lesson in network science there. But
and I have to give Kevin Bacon credit too, because even though he's a fluke of history, he's done the world a real solid. He started a nonprofit foundation called 6 Degrees that basically tries to pair celebrities, Hollywood people, etc., with lesser known charities. Right? Everybody helps. UNICEF, and everybody helps these certain big level charities. But then there's like the local children's hospital that needs help. And his charity basically pairs those Hollywood celebrities with charities that need more of an endorsement than they can get because they're lesser known. So he's really like taken this networking idea and applied it to philanthropy in a unique way that really deserves some credit.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We'll add that to the show notes for our listeners. So your book, goes off to explore a number of different topics, and one of them that I found quite interesting was that of becoming a broker. And the book reveals, somewhat surprisingly, that, and I guess you alluded to this earlier, where rather than just relying on your own network where people are like you and they like the same things and they know the same things, and effectively any introductions made within that network are going to add a little bit of value but potentially not that transformational value. And what you've identified is that people who span the gaps between different groups, such as Jane McGonigal, can basically broker information back and forth and are more powerful than the most connected people inside a tight group.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was the perfect summary. So I guess the only thing I can add is we were just talking about those people that transition, they move around, et cetera, and they're what are keep the world connected. Those are the brokers. So in any network, because of a couple different reasons, some of them are psychological, like our homophily, love of same. Some of them are structural. A network is not, if you're looking for a way to visualize a network, like we're sort of used to visualizing the little spider web, circles and lines, et cetera, type of thing. But there's a tendency a lot of times to think about a network like a piece of graph paper where everyone is equally connected to each other. And that's, we strike that as maybe the goal, and maybe it is. But the truth is that's not how it works. In reality, people cluster towards each other, and you get these sort of nooks and crannies. I mean, really, the best analogy that I can think of is it looks like an English muffin sliced in half, right? It's full of nooks and crannies where people hang out among the same people. And the people that really create the most value in networks, both because they do that linking that we were just talking about, but also because of the information sharing, especially from an innovation standpoint, because they do the information sharing, are these brokers. They're these people that learn how to build a bridge. So you referenced Jane McGonigal, who is a brilliant woman, an amazing person who basically, because of her history, started out as a game designer and then eventually started working with the worlds of psychology and medicine to show how sort of video games can actually create flow experiences, create healing in some cases, and how you can use video games and gaming design techniques to better patient outcomes. Now, I mean, those two communities, medicine and video gaming, really do not combine. Right. But yet, because of her, she's this broker between these two clusters of people that is showing, no, they do combine. And she's unlocked a tremendous amount of value. And this is another great example of the way that I was sharing earlier, that when you create value for the network, it comes back to you. Jane's had an amazing career, too. But that's because she's serving the network by being a broker between these two big clusters.
Yeah. And I mean, on this topic of being a broker, the book explores some research from Ronald Burt, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and he theorized about the opportunities inside these gaps in the social structure as structural holes. But he also went on to say that when you looked at all this data and compared it to the network map, he found that brokers, those that were discussing ideas with individuals from other clusters or groups, were significantly more likely to have valuable ideas for improvement. People who stand near the holes in social structures, he said, are at higher risk of having good ideas. And I guess, those of us that work in the space of creativity, of innovation, of entrepreneurship, we're familiar with the Medici effect, which refers to the innovation that happens when disciplines and ideas intersect. So I guess these theories very much overlap with each other.
Yeah, no, they exactly do. And that's so Ronald Burt's quote there is actually one of my favorites because it takes all the way back to sort of my first book, Myths of Creativity, which was about creativity and innovation. And this idea that we, even as individuals, we ought to have our domain of expertise, but be keeping a working knowledge of lots of other domains. And the only way that you do that is by seeking to be a structural whole and reach out to another community. And the interesting thing about organizational life, if you do this in a corporate setting where we tend to change the C to the I and use the innovation word instead of creativity, but it's all sort of from the same family. Your organizational structure is going to subtly push you to staying in your little silo, staying in that leg of the org chart and not interacting with all the others. And it's not only do you need, but the organization needs you to sort of push out of that. One of my favorite studies in the whole book showed that what the researcher called organizational misfits were the people who were most likely to get promoted and have higher salary, et cetera, because they were the people who were most likely to have those good ideas.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more on that, Dave. And I guess on clustering as well, we saw that in 2016 with a lot of the online ecochambers that people were falling into, whether they were on the left or the right. And, when Trump was elected, and your book also alludes to this, many on the left said, I can't believe he won. I don't know anybody who voted Trump.
Yeah, I wish I could say that it's all gotten better since I wrote about that. So, I like most Americans, I was... actually, I think most Americans probably weren't paying attention for the entire election returns, but I was watching the election returns that whole night. I think most Americans tuned in after about 8:30 Eastern time when everybody started going, wait, actually, Hillary might lose. And, I know a lot. I live, one of the reasons I was so drawn to this topic is that so many of these network science principles I found in my own life kind of accidentally. And I don't like to write about me. I like to write about other people. But one of them is that I grew up in the Northeast of the United States. I grew up in what we jokingly now call sort of the Acela corridor, et cetera, that area that runs from D.C. all the way to Boston, where the sort of intellectual elite and most of businesses and all of it. And it's a deep blue. It's a deep Democratic stronghold. But now I live in Oklahoma. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is smack dab in the middle of the country. Oklahoma is. I live in the city that's the lightest shade of blue of any county in Oklahoma, but it's still a very deeply red state. And so I thought it was amazing. I'm sitting there on election night and I'm watching friends I went to high school with, et cetera, going, I don't understand this. How is this happening? Who could have possibly voted? And I'm sitting there going, I know plenty of people who did that, right? And I think the most telling example, because it didn't occur to me until that night, was Michael Moore, who it occurred to months ahead of time. He basically had a warning for his own friends on the liberal side of the continuum that, you better start paying attention to this because he's gonna win because he's doing this and this and this. And he could see that because he was connected to that sort of that mid working class kind of blue collar person that kind of got ignored from that side. And unfortunately, I wish I could say that the echo chambers have gotten better, but it seems like people's reactions, at least here from the States, in the last year plus since that election have been to run further into their echo chamber. And that's really dangerous. Now, not everybody's that way. Actually, the New York Times, the major paper of record in the country, has done a pretty good job of hiring people that, actually, they're probably more likely to be center or center right, not straight from the right, but they're trying, right? And that is really important if we're ever going to sort of get out of the death spiral that U.S. politics is currently in. It's really important that we have people more deliberately trying to bridge those structural holes like we were talking about.
Yeah, and it's very easy to seek social safety by clustering with people that believe the same thing as you do, but ultimately it limits our worldview and our experience of it. And I mean, I've found just by hosting this podcast in the past couple of years, David, the amount of people that I've interviewed and so many, experts or thought leaders in their field, but oftentimes an economist will go on and contradict a technologist, and sometimes an economist will contradict another economist, and that's great.
No, come on, that never happens.
It always happens, and
yeah, I know.
It's funny, but I guess that just makes you realize that, hey, if I was to just speak to one economist and leave it at that, and then be like, okay, well, that is the theory, and therefore it's very easy for me to just believe that as if it's a gospel. But ultimately, you speak to a lot of people and you realize that there's a lot of contradictory views here. Maybe what I believed previously or what I read in this book is right to a certain degree, but I need to challenge that. And therefore, you take that sort of thinking and apply it to your political beliefs and your philosophical beliefs and everything else, and you become a much more, say, rational person rather than one who just subscribes to, say, libertarian groups on Facebook and on LinkedIn, and just surround yourself with people who look, feel, say, act the exact same way as you do.
Right, and anyone who disagrees with me is clearly a Russian bot, right?
Of
that
course.
type of thing. No, I mean, there's strong beliefs weakly held is the term that Bob Sutton uses a lot that I love. But the other thing is, I mean, this was shortly after we talk about what happened in November of 2016 in the U.S. We also sort of diagnosed the problem, and the problem is twofold. There is that love of safety and that desire to sort of be around people who think and look and act like us. But the other problem is a network effect. There's a fascinating study by Duncan Watts that basically shows that there's a little bit of that love of same that kind of kickstarts the thing, but the reality is a lot of times it's a network problem. In other words, if all you're doing is meeting new people through your existing network, then you're going to meet new people who are already like the people who are introducing you to those people. So in other words, once you sort of start down a path, you start to meet more and more people who are engaged in that path, and it pulls you deeper and deeper. So you have to make kind of, and I know I said at the top of the show that you would never have to meet strangers again, and that's true, but you do have to make a conscious effort to be aware of who is introducing you to new people and what do those people represent, et cetera. It's not enough to just sort of blindly rely on your network to bring new people into your life, because they're probably going to still think and look and act and be a lot like the people that are already in your life. So you've got to really make a deliberate effort. What I tell people is, again, the people that are sort of most different than you, that economist that disagrees with you, try and get them to introduce you to a few more people so that you can bridge out over into that area of the network to start exploring that domain.
Yeah, so be very, very intentional and deliberate about who you're connecting with rather than just relying on what's in front of you.
Exactly.
Fantastic. The book tells the story of Tim Ferriss, one of my favorite podcasters and one of the inspirations for this show. And he talks about, well, the book doesn't mention his foray at South by Southwest, but it tells a story about how he was connecting with a lot of publishers, journalists, and whatnot to effectively give the appearance that he was everywhere. And you call this the majority illusion, where you focus only on few of the right connections rather than many of the wrong connections. So would love to explore this topic, David.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So this is the majority illusion is actually a relatively new term and a relatively new study. By new, I mean like last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And what they found is essentially what Tim Ferriss stumbled into, and that's why this is such a perfect example. Tim uses a different term for it. He calls it the surround sound effect. Mm-hmm. But essentially what the majority illusion shows is that if people are, prior to that chapter in the book, we talk about this idea that there's an 80-20 rule to how many connections people have, right? It's not a normative distribution. It's a Pareto principle type thing. It's a power law. And if that's true, then the people who are most connected in the network, they're connected to more people. So the things that are popular with those people, the super connectors, can appear inside a community to be more popular than they really are. And so what Tim Ferriss did, I'll explain what Tim Ferriss did, and then we'll show you sort of how it all works. Mm-hmm. is he decided, okay, I can't be everywhere all the time. And the United States is a massive and massively diverse community. I'm not going to target everybody right off the bat. And my book is most apt to be well received by 18 to 29-year-old tech savvy males. That was his exact term. And he is, at the time, he was an 18 to 29-year-old tech savvy male. So he said, okay, what are the super connectors inside of that? What are the conferences they go to? What are the blogs that they read, et cetera? And so he started hitting up tech conference after tech conference, the biggest one, like you said, being South by Southwest, and building relationships with the journalists who were the most followed in that community of 18 to 29-year-old tech savvy males. And again, he did everything we've been talking about before the fact. He's not begging for favors right off the bat. He's building rapport and building a relationship, et cetera. And when it comes time to have the book, he's sending them a copy, or he's saying, hey, here's an idea from the book that I thought would really resonate. Would you like to write about it, et cetera? And so for the first few months of book launch, 4-Hour Workweek is everywhere. If you're an 18 to 29 tech savvy male, you're just seeing it again and again and again from the most connected people. And so you get this impression that it's hugely popular. It's actually not. Like, there was a long period of time in his career where most people had never heard of Tim Ferriss. I would argue actually still in the United States, most people have not heard about him. He's expanded out. But in the first sort of 6 months of 4-Hour Workweek, the only people that knew about him were 18 to 29 tech savvy males. But that was fine, because that was more than enough to get saturation in that community and then let it spread through those communities' networks.
Yeah, and it actually reminds me of a Kickstarter campaign that a colleague of mine ran, where they were effectively raising funds for what was it was a watch, so nothing groundbreaking in that respect. But ultimately, what they did was they established relationships with a lot of fashion bloggers, and these fashion bloggers had, say, between 10 and 50,000 readers each. But they would reach out to about 100 of these bloggers, and effectively about 25 of them agreed to write about their campaign on day one in exchange for a watch. And collectively, they were getting in front of several 100,000 fashion enthusiasts and were able to hit their target on day one of the program. Whereas if they just used, say, traditional, depending on how you use it, of course, but if they had gone the route of, say, Facebook ads and tried to go the one-to-one route, it probably would have cost them a lot of money or wouldn't have been as successful. Whereas they played the nodes in the network who had that influence in order to get the exposure they needed.
Right. And even to the point of, not trying to do a standard PR, like they could have very easily offered a bunch of watches to USA Today and the New York Times and et cetera, and it wouldn't have worked. What they did was they sort of targeted in this community who were the most followed, the most viewed, et cetera. And that's, we are, gets into some of the science behind it. We are tribal people. We take our cues from what other people in the tribe are doing, and our tribe is that part of the network that is the closest to us. And so if you appear to be really popular from the people that are in that community, you suddenly get the opinion that even if it's not actually that popular, in some of the network diagrams that they drew to test this idea of majority illusion, you could have, say, only 3 out of 12 people were actually sort of active, were actually representing this idea or promoting this idea, et cetera. And yet it would look to everybody else in the network that, man, everybody is talking about this, when in reality, only, a little more than 30%, was it 36% of people are talking about it. Yeah.
Well, you're not paying attention to where it's not being published. You're only paying attention to where it is being published. So that makes a lot of sense.
25%. Sorry, it's not 36%. That was awful.
Close enough. So, for many, many years, when we think of, corporate executives, we think of them being out on the greens, on the ninth hole, going for a beer afterwards, whatever the case may be, as, that traditional form of corporate networking, right? At least amongst the males. And your book, I guess, builds upon this notion, where it suggests that the best networking events have nothing to do with networking. In fact, they're all about activities. And, I know from my own experiences where I've gone on and most recently I went to an acro yoga class where you lift people you don't even know. You literally met them that evening up above you. And it's confronting on a number of levels, Dave, I'll be honest with you. But nonetheless, it does create bonds that would otherwise be very hard to create in that sort of formal structured networking setting where you're just standing around in a circle, handing out your business cards, saying the same sort of spiel to every single person you meet about what you do and why you're there, and asking them the same questions, and half the time not even listening to the response. Why are activities such a powerful tool when it comes to networking?
Yeah, well, I guess first we should say why doing that exactly what you described is not all that effective, right? So I have a lot of favorite studies from this book, but one of my other favorites was a study of a cocktail hour, of a networking mixer. Basically, in this executive MBA program, they put together these are executives, so these are 45 to 55-year-old males and females in companies that are paying extra money to be able to do this program, custom tailored, so they can get an MBA, et cetera. And one of the things that these students are asking for is, we want the opportunity to meet more people. We want to have, like, whenever we come for our on-campus residencies, can we open up with a mixer, et cetera. So they decided to, being academics, they decided to do a study around it. And so they basically they survey everybody in this cohort of 100 people, and they survey them on who else do you know. And everybody knows about a third of the cohort already. And so they go, okay, cool. We're going to put together a networking mixer, and we're actually going to use these little radio frequency tags. We can track who talks to who and how much time they spend talking to people, et cetera. And all of these executives, remember, are saying that the goal is we want to meet more people. So they throw a networking event, what we always do when we think about wanting to meet more people. Yeah. And then after, they're running the numbers, and they're showing that the average person, the average executive in this mixer, spent 50% of their time with someone from the 33% of people that they already knew. So in other words, like random chance, just literally walking into the room and going, I'm going to talk to everyone wearing green, would have done a better job of introducing you to new people than would what most people do, which is they cling to the people they know, and then the people that are sort of like them and work in their industry, et cetera, because we like that familiar, like we've been talking about. So given that, one of the things that's really interesting is that when you set up that environment, people stick to their script. They have that kind of homophily pull towards the same. But when you give them an activity to focus on, now they're focused on that, and more diverse connections sort of happen as an accident. So acro yoga is a great example because it draws from a bunch of different people who are interested in a bunch of different things. I tried to write it, we edited it out. Maybe one day I'll get to write about this, but I've, for the last 11 years, done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which in the United States is really popular because of UFC and mixed martial arts. Yep. And because of that, it draws a wide range of people. I mean, on any given practice session, I'm in there with, just sort of the standard people you think that we'd drawn to fighting sports, but also doctors and lawyers and police officers. And I mean, it's an incredibly diverse crew of people that I get to meet that I would probably never meet in a networking mixer, because there wouldn't be a networking mixer for doctors, lawyers, blue collar workers, and police officers. You would never put on that event to begin with. But even if you did, I would probably stick around people that are like me, because that's our natural tendency to do. So these shared activities create that opportunity by accident to meet a more diverse set of individuals.
Yeah, definitely. And are you a black belt, Dave?
So I am. I've been a black belt for about a year and a half now. I think October 2000 actually, I don't remember. I think 2016. So a little over a year and a half.
Yeah, fantastic.
It has been absolutely fun. And again, the network connections, the people that you meet, they're not your standard people you would meet in the course of the workday. And it's one of what I love about it is the sport, but that's a side benefit that happens by accident, which is great. So take all of that networking mixer time you might have used to do and just give that up and take up a hobby, and especially take up one that draws from a diverse set of interests. Yeah. And I guarantee you'll have a better network in a year.
Definitely. And a side note there, jiu-jitsu is definitely one of those things whereby it does serve to also build a lot of mental resilience and that sort of growth mindset. It's like, what did I screw up this time? And try and get better with each and every moment. And I guess, similarly to acro yoga, you'd be more than comfortable being in all sorts of uncompromising positions with your body, David.
You definitely, similar to acro yoga, you build a lot of trust because you're working usually with a partner, and yes. So there's a lot of trust and a lot of intimacy right off the bat.
Yep, fantastic. One of the last things I wanted to touch on, Dave, before we jump into our lightning round, was the topic of multiplicity, where two people may have more than one type of relationship, and the research suggests that these types of relationships are actually stronger than if you only have one type of relationship. And I found, when I was reading through this, I found it that's an interesting topic. And I started thinking of relationships that I have with people, whereby I may have a professional relationship with them. I may, say, go to acro yoga with them. I may have a personal relationship with them, whatever the case may be. And I definitely saw some evidence in my own immediate network whereby multiple types of relationships do foster stronger bonds. But I guess, what can our audience take out of this insofar as, say, networking is concerned?
Yeah, so that's a brilliant summary of multiplicity. This idea that the more context in which you see someone, the more types of ties that you have with them, the deeper the relationship gets faster. The problem is that is not our default. Again, to use the terrible analogy of your network as a list of contacts on your phone, what do? Well, we sort them into folders, right? Or we tag them, but we put them into buckets based on a work context or a home context or an acro yoga context, et cetera. And so when we're doing that, the downside of that is that we don't explore opportunities for multiplicity, right? Because we only talk about them in the context of work, or we only see them at acro yoga, et cetera. So when your current contacts, one of the things you need to do is learn more about them to get that relationship deeper faster. But the other trick is that if you are in that situation where you're going to meet a new person, what is our tendency, especially if we're in a work context, it's to ask questions like, so what do you do? Right, which is a bright signal that you only care about them inside of a work context because you're asking them a work question. It's a bad question overall, but from the standpoint of multiplicity, that's the reason. So what I encourage people, especially if you're meeting somebody in a work setting, right, you already know you have that in common. So look for something else. So I'll ask questions like, where did you grow up? Or what excites you right now, right? Or what's your favorite hobby? Or my favorite question is, who's your favorite superhero? Because you can learn a lot about people just by knowing who their favorite superhero is. But any of those questions steers the conversation away from this work context. It'll probably drift back into work if you're meeting them at a sort of work function. But the point is, because you're at work, try and find something else without invading their privacy. Try and find something else that'll help you build a multiplex tie to them.
Yeah, it's kind of like those Tim Ferriss lightning around questions. What would you put on a billboard? Something like that people aren't expecting. That actually gets them to think and does tell you a lot more about them than just their job title.
Exactly. So, man, Tim Ferriss owes us some sponsorship money, man. We've been talking about him a lot today.
I know, right? I'm going to send this episode to him and be like, hey, man, you got to pay up.
I actually still need to send him a copy of the book with the fact that he's in it. So I reached out to Donna, his assistant, his longtime assistant, and she and I were trying to find a time to get on his calendar for an interview, but it was writing this right when he was prepping for the TED Talk. So I never got to actually sort of interview him direct pre-publication. So I still need to send him a copy of the book with that like flagged and be like, hey, you're in,
Well, if you can get onto the Tim Ferriss show, I think sales of the book will naturally just skyrocket. So
especially with 18 to 29-year-old tech-savvy males.
Yes. Well, exactly. So keep pushing. Speaking of which, who's your favorite superhero, Dave?
Oh, Batman. It's always been Batman.
Yeah.
Batman.
Definitely.
I mean, the reason is actually, so if you want to know, because it's the reasons that are exciting from a multiplexity standpoint. Batman and Iron Man, if you're Marvel, they're essentially the same character, is someone who sort of, granted, he had some life advantages, but he wasn't bit by a radioactive spider. He's not from another planet. He's a regular guy who worked really, really hard and then learned jujitsu and became a superhero, right? So he's much more, used that term growth mindset or before. He's much more sort of motivating to me than like, oh, you were a space alien and you landed here when you were an infant. I can't relate to that. So it's always been Batman.
Yep, fantastic. Yeah, I definitely would opt for Batman as well, just because I'm not a fan of Superman's apparel and the red jocks outside the pants. So anyway, speaking of rapid fire questions, Dave, last time you were on the show, we hadn't started with our lightning round, so it's time to throw you into our 3-question lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
No, this is new. I don't know if I'm ready for this. All right, I'll give it my best.
Well, we warmed you up with the superhero question. So question 1, Dave, is if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company life cycle, so we could be talking about Apple Computer in the late 70s, which company would it be and why?
Hershey Foods, right towards the retirement of Milton Hershey. So not a lot of people know Milton Hershey is the original social entrepreneur. So he started the chocolate company. It was like his 4th company that he started, and it finally worked. And then he and his wife, actually, they didn't have kids of their own. They started adopting orphans. And when his wife died, she died far younger than him. He set up it's still there. It's called the Milton Hershey School for Orphans. And when he was getting towards the end of his own career, he started transitioning his shares of the company into a trust that runs the school. So still the majority shareholder of Hershey Foods is the Milton Hershey School for Orphans. It's not that the company donates a certain amount to this charity. It's that the charity literally owns the company. And I think it'd be really, really cool to be able to see sort of that and how it was set up. Because this is 100 years before social entrepreneurship was a cool thing. Maybe not 100, but it was a long time ago. And we're only now sort of seeing a lot of people trying to do that with their own organization. I think it'd be really cool to have an inside peek at how he set that up.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic answer. Question number 2, Dave, is if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, and it might be Milton Hershey, who would it be and what would you ask?
I could ask anyone a question, dead or alive. I don't know. I'll give you a sort of semi-reflective one. So I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old right now. And, every stage of raising kids, the sort of new questions that you should ask them. So what I would love is I would love the ability to ask them a question as an adult about me and how I did, not me. Does that make sense? So it's not that I want to ask someone a question. It's I would really want to know the answer to a few things about how our relationship, their impression of our relationship as a kid was, but knowing that they would be honest because they're not talking to me. They're just talking to some other person. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting reflective sort of answer. I guess it would be great if you could jump into a time machine, go forward 20 years, and they're like, well, actually, you could have been better at X, Y, and Z, and then you go back in time.
Exactly. I would love to know that now from their perspective 20 years from now so that I can change course now instead of sort of doing it on the fly. Yeah.
Fantastic. And lucky last, Dave. I mean, in the last couple of years, you've obviously published under new management, Friend of a Friend's about to come out. You were selected as one of the world's top business thought leaders by Thinkers 50, and your TED Talk is closing in on 2 million views. So you've obviously achieved quite a lot in the last couple of years. Do you have any rituals or routines to help you stay on top of your game?
I'm sure that I do. I would say I have in the last 6 months or so, I've had a rhythm to my day that I've really liked. So it's not an individual, a psych up ritual, et cetera. But so like I said, I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they usually wake up first. They wake us up, and we try and spend as much time before they're off to school as we can. So that's in the morning, and then we drop them off at the bus or drive them into school. And then I make it a point to write from whenever I'm back in my office until about 10:30, because 10:30 is the time I need to leave to get to the gym in time for 11 o'clock practice in jiu-jitsu. Then I head for 11 o'clock practice, come back, shower, and then afternoons are sort of doing these interviews. And so the routine is dividing sort of time into that time with them. And then, by the way, when they get home from school at 3, then maybe we'll do some work. I'll respond to emails while they're hanging out, et cetera, but we'll be around each other again. So the routine is really dividing that time with them, but also segmenting out that the Cal Newport would call it the deep work, the needing to do the writing piece from all of the other stuff. And it just so happens to be divided by jiu-jitsu, which is great.
Yeah. And I think, cutting your day up into compartments can be quite effective because it basically gets your mind into the zone to say, okay, between 1 and 3, I'm just doing this. And, doing away
so it's exactly what we have. So we have kind of 3 90-minute chunks that represent different things of the work that I need to do. And I don't do one thing while we're doing the other thing.
Yeah. And you're not checking your phone relentlessly while you're trying to write, Dave.
Exactly.
Fantastic. So people can pick up a copy, they can pre-order a copy of the book on Amazon. We'll add that to the show notes for our listeners. They can obviously find out more about yourself, Dave, at davidburkus.com, and hit you up on Twitter at David Burkus. That's Burkus, Burkus, and we'll add all of that to the show notes. Anywhere else they should go to connect or find out a little bit more?
Yeah. So if you're listening to this, you're part of a special club. You've made it all the way to the end of the episode. You're the end of the podcast club. And like Steve said, the book's available for pre-order. I hope you do that. I hope you do it in sort of triplicate. But no matter what, for being a new member of this club, I have a small gift, which is if you go to davidburkus.com/future, davidburkus.com/future, we'll send you this really cool, you can download it. It's an audio course, or think about it like a little podcast series that covers a couple different insights from the book. We already covered one with that who do you know in blank question, but the whole point of the course is to learn how to give and get introductions properly based on these sort of solid principles. And so that whole, we call it the How to Connect audio course. That's yours. I already know that you love long form audio, so you're going to love this, davidburkus.com/future.
Awesome. We'll add that to the show notes. Sounds like a very valuable resource. Any parting words of wisdom for the audience, Dave?
No, I mean, if you're just tuning in and you haven't had a chance to watch listen to episode 9 with David Burkus, you really start to need binge watch this show. The addition of the lightning round questions are awesome, and it's been awesome to see how this thing has grown over the years. So, congratulations to you, but also congratulations to the listeners who found a really cool show.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. Well, I'll let you get back to it, Dave. You've got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old to get back to, and your jiu-jitsu class and everything else, and I've got to get to the office. So it's been awesome chatting again, and look forward to next time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Cheers, David. Hi guys, Steve again. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to discuss episodes like this one, request guests for new episodes, propose questions, and access exclusive podcast-related content, join the brand new Future Squared Facebook group. Just search for the Future Squared group on Facebook or visit bit.ly/Future Squared group. That's bit.ly/Future Squared group. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, please take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. This episode was powered by Collective Campus. Until next time, Future Squared is out.